Hello and welcome to the Overlanding podcast, the original podcast dedicated to vehicle-dependent travel. I'm your host, Andy Smith. Throughout the series, I'll be chatting with adventurous people who have chosen to travel the world by bicycle, motorcycle, car and truck. The aim of the podcast is to discover what motivates people to embark on life-changing journeys and to hear some incredible stories along the way. Over the past 14 episodes, we've met many overlanders who've taken on some epic adventures. This episode is no different. We talk with Mark White, who over the years has focused all his overlanding energies on really exploring one area, Morocco. Having visited the country countless times, Mark is a bit of an aficionado for this frequently visited overland destination. So without further ado, let's get started. Good morning. Joining me around the virtual campfire today is Mark White. Morning.
Morning.
Sorry, we've got cups of tea on the go this morning to keep us warm, so there may be some slurping throughout the conversation.
I'll try not to be too loud.
Okay, so the reason I wanted to get you on was for many people, kind of Morocco, and I've used this term in a previous podcast, is almost a gateway drug to overlanding for a lot of people, and especially from Europe, it's the destination where people typically go first for a couple of reasons. One, to get a taste of overlanding. Two, it's incredibly convenient. Three, I think a lot of people go there to test vehicles before taking them on a longer trip.
Yeah.
And so I was really keen to speak to you because you've literally just come back from Morocco.
Yes, 2 weeks ago. Fresh back.
Yeah, so you're probably still full of the excitement and reflection of the kind of what you've experienced. So, we were just chatting before we started recording, but this wasn't the first time you've been to Morocco, right?
No, this is now 15 years of going out to Morocco. 6 years overlanding.
Yeah.
6-trip overlanding, and before that 9 years of being the stereotypical tourist on a BA flight to Marrakesh and renting apartments, staying in hotels. But when we first started going, we didn't hear another English voice from getting off a BA flight at Marrakesh until 2-3 weeks later when we got back on a flight back to London. Fell in love with the country, I think, very early on. And I'd always said to anybody, all the friends we used to come out with us, if I ever get made redundant, I'm going to buy a 4x4 and I'm going to go and explore. So 2011, when the recession was in full swing, I got made redundant, bought the truck, and off I went, and I haven't looked back since.
Yeah. How did you find the kind of difference? Obviously you'd travelled there as a typical tourist, flying in and out. Had you explored much of the country prior, like throughout that time as a tourist?
We'd tend to fly in, rent an apartment, and then hire a car for a few days, go off and explore a bit of Morocco. So we'd done all the tourist sites, so we'd done Marrakesh and the towns and driving around, and realised, I think, from those trips what Morocco has to offer in terms of landscape and variety, and just the stunning views around every corner. And being made redundant, despite being a slight negative on the income side of things, gave me the opportunity to get a 4x4 and go and explore some of the more remote areas. So I've been skipping the touristy stuff and getting out into the middle of nowhere, getting into some sort of trouble sometimes, picking the wrong routes, but thoroughly enjoying it.
Yeah. And so the first trip you went down with the 4x4, did you drive all the way down through France and Portugal? France and Spain?
No, ferry to Spain, and then the drive down. And the first trip I went on, because it was the first time I'd done a overlanding trip of any type, I booked myself onto an organised tour with Waypoint Tours at the time. Didn't actually own a 4x4 or a vehicle suitable for the trip when I booked.
Yeah.
I had quite a short space of time to buy something and get it sorted out and ready for a trip. And ended up with a Toyota Land Cruiser. which has had quite a colourful history with me. It's now in its second ownership with me.
Okay.
Which is a very long story, and not the most interesting part. But that first trip I did 3 weeks with Waypoint Tours. We went down into Western Sahara as part of a group. Really learnt the sort of basics, the way of living on the road, I suppose, and then stayed on for another 3 weeks on my own after that, before having to come back and get back into the real world and working.
Yeah. And so on that organised group, were you camping every night, or did they organise hotels or a combination of both?
It was camping every night. We went right down into the Western Sahara on that trip, so majority was wild camping. And with the last night in a nice riad in Marrakesh on the way home.
Yeah.
For the people who were heading home. So yeah, it was very much camping, and the wild camping that's part of why I go, is to get out into the middle of nowhere, sit back, enjoy the quiet and the peace and the tranquility.
Yeah.
Watch the stars, daydream a bit.
Yeah. And those kind of trips, because we travelled down there that way in 2014, I think, I'm guessing here. And we went down there as a kind of intermittent break from our longer trip. It's a very long story anyway. We were in Mongolia, had to come home, ended up going down to Morocco. And we did encounter quite a few people on those trips. Was it a mix of nationalities, or were they all Brits on that?
No, we were all Brits on that trip, from all over the country, different backgrounds. There were some who'd been on trips before. There was a couple of people like me on the first trip, with all sorts of different backgrounds. Really good group of people, which made the trip a great success. Everybody got on well together. There was always a good bit of banter going on, a good laugh in the evenings around the campfire and the evening meal.
Yeah.
A really enjoyable trip.
And are those trips typically focused on the kind of driving aspect? Are people going there for driving, or are they going there to experience the culture, or a combination of both?
I think the majority, certainly on the trip I went, the majority there were for the driving and the getting out into the middle of nowhere rather than the tourist sites.
Yeah.
There were a couple of people. There was one couple who hadn't been to Morocco before. They did want to see a bit more of the country, but mostly it was focused on the driving and getting out into the remote parts of Morocco and seeing what is and isn't there, and enjoying that desolation of the Western Sahara. And
I think it's an incredibly interesting country, especially if you drive down through Spain, or if you take the ferry to Spain, or drive down through France and Spain. That kind of transition between kind of the familiarity of Europe and then just being so alien in such a short period of time. It's like an hour and 40 minutes or something, the crossing, isn't it?
It is.
And that 1 hour and 40 minutes is not a massive distance. On a good day, you can see the land across the straits. But the transition from the familiarity of Europe to the alienness of Africa is incredible. And I think taking that trip for a first time, especially for Brits who might not have travelled, I think a lot of the kind of British overlanders, and I think it's slightly different for the rest of Europe, maybe, because we're an island and we're isolated. I think a lot of European overlanders are more open to travelling into other countries because it's so easy for them to, the Germans can nip to anywhere they want and come back without any big issues. But the fact that we have to get on a ferry or go through the channel or fly or whatever automatically means there's some kind of barrier between us and the rest of the world. And I think a lot of British overlanders kind of get into overlanding through a love of 4x4 and driving, whereas I think a lot of European overlanders get into overlanding for a love of travel. So I think there's a slightly different perspective of how the kind of needs and what we're expecting from an overland trip. And that's why I found it really interesting for Brits who go to Morocco, especially ones who go for the first time. It must be quite daunting to get down to that ferry and cross from Gibraltar.
Yeah, I think so. And I think for a lot of Brits, the difference in culture and just that short space of distance from Gibraltar across the straits into Morocco, you're looking at the sort of travelling distance most people experience of going to the south of France, to Spain, to Italy for the summer holidays, and all of a sudden they're in a very different culture, a very different way of life. So I think a lot of people experience quite a bit of culture shock when they first get there, the chaos and the confusion of Moroccan everyday life, where nothing is straightforward and nothing is quite organised or as it seems, can be a real eye-opener for a lot of people. And I think for British overlanders, there's a lot of people who are doing it as their annual leave holiday rather than on a big long trip. So the time to get out of Europe eats into a lot of their available holiday time. So to get that big distance down to Spain, cross Spain into Morocco, and then get further down into the really interesting bits is quite an undertaking for a lot of English overlanders.
Yeah.
The trips I've done, you really need a 3-week block to make the most of travelling all the way down to Morocco and not being in a mad panic to whiz round and go back to work.
Yeah. I think the beauty in it though is it is that close, and I'm fully aware that there are people who would like to go on big overlanding trips, but because of commitments of mortgages and jobs and work and family, whatever else, they don't have that luxury of time that maybe other people do. And I think that's the beauty of Morocco, because I'm not sure how long is the ferry. I've never taken the ferry down to Spain.
The ferry it's 20 hours from Plymouth, 24 from Portsmouth down to Santander or Bilbao. So it's swings and roundabouts compared to the drive through France. I hate ferries. I'll admit that. I suffer from seasickness. If there was a way of getting that distance covered quickly, which wasn't a ferry, I'd be all up for it. But the nice thing with the ferry is when you get off the ferry after that 20-hour sail, you're fairly well relaxed. You're ready to hit the road, get the mileage done, get down, get home, to the...
Oh, and the same going back as well to get home. Yeah. I think it's... we didn't actually meet a huge amount of Brits when we were down there, and we were down there for 4 months. We met an incredibly large amount of Germans. We met quite a few Dutch overlanders. We did meet one couple who were British throughout the whole 4 months we were there, and I found that quite surprising. I was expecting to come across a lot more Brits down there than we actually did. And I just think it's an incredible destination. Like you said before, the kind of diversity in landscape. And it's such a huge area to go and explore. Yeah. I think it, in the regards of people... Well, like yourself, for example, you've been down 6 times now with the vehicle, and I bet you're still discovering and finding new places.
Oh yeah, all the time.
Yeah,
all the time, finding something new, an area to go. I might have spotted a track which looked interesting on a previous trip, which I've left as a waypoint in the sat nav. So I'm always finding something new to see. I still don't feel like I've finished seeing Morocco, even after 15 years. There's bits of Morocco I've never quite got to. There's bits I've whizzed through on the way home or on the way down there, or just skirting through between 2 other bits which are there earmarked to go back and explore again. Particularly the east side of the country, I've only really been up that side once, up through the Wrekin Plateau. That's an interesting part of the country. There's a lot to explore out there.
And that's interesting, because I think a lot of overlanders bypass that. And I know we briefly popped in that direction on our way home, and it's when we got there we were like, we should have designated more time to explore around here, but it wasn't really on our radar because a lot of other overlanders hadn't been there, which is kind of how we dictated our route to some degree.
Yeah, certainly. I think for the English overlanders, it's not one of the traditional where do you go in Morocco, where the classic routes, which tends to be the high Atlas mountains and then getting down onto the edge of the Sahara and Zagora and the food.
Yeah.
A lot of European overlanders go down through the east of the country because they're catching ferries into Ceuta or Melilla, Nador, so they're coming into that side of the country and then use that way as a scoot down. But it's not an area which is talked about a lot.
No.
It's interesting. 2012, on my second trip, we were out for a month. A friend from London came with me, long-term old friend from school, long-term travelling companion, came with me, and we went up through that side of the country. We followed the old French Morocco-Algerian railway from the south end of Morocco all the way back up to the Mediterranean coast, and it's a fascinating bit of the country, very different to what most people go and see, which are the mountains and the edge of the desert. Completely different part of the country, very untouristy. You still get people stopping and watching open-mouthed almost as they see tourists coming through, which gives it another edge to it, and finding things out there. As I say, we followed the old French-Algerian railway, which is partly in use in the north of the country. The south end is been out of use for a long time now, and that was fascinating to see some of the old French colonial infrastructure there, how it's been left to deteriorate, I suppose. We also had a great day looking round an old Foreign Legion fort, which we stumbled across looking for somewhere to wild camp. We drove past it, and I said to my friend, I said, I bet that's a good spot to camp in there, but somebody will be using it for a farm or to keep livestock, and so we didn't go in. We went and camped elsewhere. The next day we drove past it and we went in and had a look, and that was it was the perfect camp spot. Dead level, nice big wall round it, absolutely perfect. But the fascinating thing for us there was the graffiti on the walls from the people who were stationed there, and
okay.
a lot of the people who'd been stationed there had put either their name or their initials, the date, and where they were from, carved into the plasterwork of the walls. And people from all over, huge numbers of American names there. That was fascinating, just to stumble across something like that and spend the time looking at it.
I think that kind of willingness to explore is, when it's rewarded like that, is amazing, because one of the beautiful things about the way we travel is we get the opportunity to go where no other tourists go, and typically, somewhere like that you think would be on the tourist trail at some point, but maybe due to its inaccessibility or location, it was
a bit remote. And I think as well, because that side of Morocco isn't really on the tourist trail. There's not a lot of infrastructure there. There's a few places starting to come up, but it's very sparse on hotels and accommodation, so you really do need to be self-sufficient to make the most of that part of the country. Which worked great for us. It's what, as I say, it's one of those areas which I've earmarked to go back and spend a bit more time in one day.
And throughout your kind of duration taking these trips, how's your vehicle developed? I know just at the beginning there you said you'd literally bought the vehicle just before your first trip. How did you prep it for that first trip? Or
for the first trip, I think I did what a lot of people do when they're thinking about doing an overlanding trip. You sit down, you look at the internet, you look at what other people have done, and you produce this great long list of all the equipment which the world tells you must have. And then you toss up the prices and think, God, I'm not going anywhere with a bill like that. So I had the list of winches and bumpers and roof tents and roof racks and all the rest of it. And I was out of work. I didn't have a lot of money. It was quite a big investment to buy the truck. Really, for that first trip, I decided I wanted to sleep inside. Partly monetary reasons, the cost of a roof rack and a rooftop tent, it's expensive, and not having done a trip before, I wasn't going to put that sort of investment into specialist equipment, so I decided I wanted to sleep inside the truck first off started looking at old Defender 110s. The stereotypical English overland vehicle.
Well, you're talking to a Toyota owner here, right?
I think it's built into the English DNA. Somebody mentions 4x4, and that mental picture of a Defender pops into your mind straight away. And then I realised that looking around, decent ones are expensive. I've driven them through work. They're not the most comfortable of things, and with the planned trip I realised I wanted air conditioning, which put a Land Rover of that out of my budget range. I started looking around at alternatives and ended up with the Land Cruiser I've got, which has been... It's been a great vehicle. It's not been without its problems. Some of them are a very long story. Mostly it's been kept lightweight and simple on the preparation. So for that first trip, took out all the rear seats, built myself a sleeping platform in the back. I took a tent with me in case I didn't get on with sleeping in the back, put some all-terrain tyres on it, and off I went.
Yeah.
And it worked.
Yeah.
It worked very, very well. With that first trip, with the group, we had Barry, who runs Waypoint Tours, who does a lot of trips, so he's got a big Land Cruiser, very well kitted out for doing it. And we had another couple who, like me, first time trip, bit more money available to them than I had. They had an ex-Paris-Dakar Defender 110.
Really? Okay.
They had all the original build reports for it. It come in at about £80,000 worth of preparation. After 3 weeks, they still didn't know how half of it worked, but they had a thoroughly good time, as did I. But I think it just showed that you can go out in a virtually bog standard car, which is well maintained, serviceable, and enjoy a trip, as well as going out and buying all the bells and whistles. 2013, I went back to the Western Sahara for a second time, and another friend came with me who bought an old Isuzu Trooper for £1,500. That did the full trip. It probably used more oil than it used diesel, but it got there, it got back again, and it coped.
Yeah.
And I think one of the keys in my experience is making sure it's well maintained. I think my setup works well. I'm fairly light. I'm not burdened with a lot of additional weight. I just weighed the truck last week with all my kit on it, and it's under the max weight for the truck quite significantly. So that seems to work very well for me.
Yeah. I think it's important to weigh up the pros and cons when you're and to be really realistic about what kind of trip you're achieving. If for example you're traveling around the world and sleeping in the vehicle every night, then you do probably need a roof tent. And again, like for us, we were sleeping in the roof tent every night, and our trip was planned for 2.5-3 years. And so we chose the specific roof tent that we did with the idea that it takes about 2 seconds to set up and about 20 seconds to pack away. With the we knew we just wouldn't be asked with unpacking a massive folding out flappy roof tent every night and packing it away, because it's just too much of a chore on a daily basis. And I think certainly if you're planning kind of shorter trips, even up to 2 months, 2-3 months, I think you can get away with going in a pretty much standard car. Obviously, if you're cooking for yourself, you might need to take a fridge or a cool box. I know I've certainly done shorter trips where we've just taken a cool box and bought ice, and that's all we've needed. And again, it's a very British thing, I think, because a lot of people again are approaching overlanding through the 4x4 scene. I think they've done a lot of green laning in England, and then I think overlanding in the last 5 years has become a lot more popular and not mainstream, but I think certainly the 4x4 magazines and the publications are starting to feature it more. Which has probably inspired a lot of Brits who've seen all this new equipment they can buy. Like before, all the green laners just bought a Land Rover and some knobbly tyres and went green laning, but now they've seen all this new equipment. So I think a lot of people are prepping cars to a really high standard. again, I've mentioned this in one of the previous podcasts. We were at the Overland Adventure Show, and the amount of vehicles there that were prepped to a ridiculously high standard, like you said, like 60, 70, 80,000 pounds worth of Land Rover, and they actually hadn't left the country in it, and that just blew my mind. I was like, well, that's like 3 times our entire budget for driving around the world. I was like, if you just spent that money, you could have like driven around the world for 3 years. And another, just to go back to another podcast I recorded recently, there was a family took their 2 kids, and they had a pretty much bog standard Nissan Patrol. They didn't have a roof tent. They had a good set of tyres on it, and again, it was well maintained. And that's generally all you need. And if you're looking for adventure, you can find it in any vehicle.
Oh yeah.
Which
You've just got to look at the diverse vehicles you see on the internet with people doing good long trips, and sometimes you meet them in the weirdest places. This year's trip, a Peugeot 205 convertible in the middle of a desert. With some French guys and a puncture. So they were part of an organised trip.
We saw them one year as well. They do a Peugeot 205 rally, don't they?
Yeah, there's 205 Club, 2CV Club, and the Renault 5 clubs. All the French ones all do big annual trips to Morocco, and they go out in what a lot of people would see as being an unsuitable vehicle, and they have a whale of a time. Not necessarily the most comfortable way of experience some of it. We saw the 2CV lot a few years ago, and it didn't look like the most comfortable way of travelling, but it looked like they were having a great deal of fun doing it. So yeah, it's what you make of the vehicle and where you want to go, and probably having an understanding of the limitations. This year's trip, I met a young English girl in a third, was sharing the same campsite, who had a Dacia Duster rental car. She really wanted to get out into the desert, but didn't want to go out on her own in a rental car. And the next day she followed me across to Zagora, had a great time. Bog standard road tyres, no problems at all. Not something I would do on a regular basis, but on a known route where you can expect reasonable conditions. And I think the other thing a lot of people forget in Morocco is a lot of the routes are what the locals use with whatever they're driving. And there's been more than one occasion where I've spent all day crawling down a riverbed or up a mountainside, thinking, God, we're doing really well here. Low ranges in, and we've crawled up, and you get to the top, and there's a village with a transit van parked next to it, or a Citroen, and you think, it's not that tough, really.
I have a friend who's obsessed with transit vans, and he tells me every time that I need to sell my Toyota and buy a 4x4 Transit. He'd be highly amused. I don't think you even need the 4x4 to get to half of these places.
No.
And it's very true, and I think it's to do with kind of trip expectations as well, and like I said previously, I think a lot of the Brits go there for the driving, and it is a stunning place to drive because you will encounter landscapes that you just, incredibly diverse. Up in the mountains in the Middle Atlas, the Middle Atlas especially, you can find some incredibly lush green valleys and kind of forests and some stunning landscape. But that kind of diversity as well, and the challenge, I think, is what draws a lot of Brits down there. I think they like the idea of saying that they've driven through a bit of the Sahara, or they've driven in sand dunes. Kind of, what was the main appeal for you when you decided to take like the 4x4 down for the first time? Was it to get out and see these places, or was it mostly the driving?
It was to get out and see the places. That was my main draw. I've always been into cars. Younger days, fast cars. I do quite a few track days each year. I've got a car back at home which I use specifically for track days. So I love driving. There's no two ways about that. I do love driving, and I'll quite happily spend 10-12 hours a day driving. It really doesn't bother me. But that first trip, it was to get out and see bits of Morocco which you just couldn't get to in a rental car. and really see some of the bits which are off the tourist trail. I think, again, it's something which some people don't enjoy when they first visit Morocco, is the hassle you get in the tourist centres, the hard sell, people trying to get you to buy a carpet or whatever. It's I'm used to it. It washes over me. I play the game with the locals, have a good laugh with them, but it was to get away from that side of things and see some of the unspoilt side of Morocco. And I remember that first trip, there was 6 English vehicles, and some of the little villages we drove through the Western Sahara, some of the kids had never seen a right-hand drive vehicle before, and you'd see them watch you approach and think, oh look, something exciting's happening, a whole load of foreigners coming. As you passed, they'd twig that the steering wheel and the driver were on the wrong side, and you'd see them telling their mates and pointing, the steering wheel's on the wrong side. And it's seeing that side of the country, I think, which is one of the big draws, as well as the stunning scenery. I spent a bit of time with this year's trip just basing myself in one location and doing circular routes to try and explore areas a bit more. Went south into the Anti-Atlas around Talouine, and I've done quite a lot of routes through the Anti-Atlas. Thought I knew the Anti-Atlas quite well and what sort of landscape it was going to be, what sort of views I'd be seeing, albeit something new. And the area I drove through was totally different to what I expected, which was a real eye-opener. Totally surprising. And another area which I plan to go back to and explore a bit more detail when I get the chance next.
Yeah, we got lost up there for a couple of days once. What kind of, how are you navigating? You use...
I've got a Garmin sat-nav, which I use for my routing on the road, but I do an awful lot of planning before I go. So combination of OSM maps and being a nice free resource, and I'm finding over the years, particularly in Morocco, the maps are getting better and better as more people input into the resource,
the open source ones,
and they're getting a lot of the off-road routes in, which is great. And then I when I'm planning the routes, I tend to have an idea of, right, I've got X amount of time, because most of the trips have been an annual leave break from work. I've got X amount of time. I know I want to go here. I know I want to go here. How do I connect the dots up? I'll plan a route on the computer. I'll then check it back on Google Earth, because there's a few times now I've been caught out with expecting there to be a route through in a car, and it's actually a goat track, and when you spend all day crawling up a mountain valley to find it's a dead end and you've got to go back, it's part of the adventure, but it can get a bit frustrating. So I find the route planning almost as much fun as getting out there in a way, and trying to connect the dots together. This year I didn't really have a plan of attack. I had the initial plan for this year's trip was to head down into the Western Sahara again, and get all the way down to Dakhla off-road, which is about 800 to 1,000 kilometres off-road.
Okay.
But it's not a trip I'd do in a solo vehicle. I had a couple of other guys in Land Cruisers who were interested in coming. Unfortunately, both of them couldn't make it this year with family commitments and work commitments. I wasn't going to let that stop me, so I went anyway, but didn't go down into Western Sahara. So I had no real route planned. It was just, I've got some time, let's just see where things go. And I think last few days since I've been back, looking back at the sat-nav track logs, looks like a drunk spider's crawled across the map. There was very clearly no rhyme or reason. I was going backwards and forwards over the same bits several times, but slightly different routes, maybe down at the next valley across. Found some fascinating bits of Morocco. I seem to get into a good habit this year of finding off-road routes which clearly nobody had driven for a long time, which almost caught me out on a couple of occasions. I had one fantastic track up through the edge of the southern edge of the High Atlas, single track ledge on the side of a mountain, and I remember driving like, nobody's been along here for a long time, and you got a bit higher, and the views were getting more stunning. You think, this is a fantastic route, this is. Why don't more people know about this? And you start to see some rockfall damage on the track, and think, well, yeah, that's not too bad. It's just half of the course in Morocco, and started to wonder, I hope I can get through to the end. And got to about 10 kilometres from the end of the track, and the whole thing's gone.
Yeah.
Which at 4 o'clock in the afternoon
is a bit of an arse.
The other downside with being solo completely on my own this year was I'm on a single car width ledge with a sheer drop, and turning round isn't an option. Yes, I can reverse back, but that's where that second person, a passenger, somebody to help guide you back really would have come in handy.
Yeah.
And a week or so later, another route which clearly wasn't regularly driven by anybody with any common sense, I suppose. Getting towards the end of the day, track washed out in a riverbed, no way through. That wasn't too much of a problem. Turning round to come back, I managed to get the truck stuck. Silly mistake, took the wrong line coming out of a riverbed, and the back end just swung round and wedged up against a rock, so I couldn't reverse back out. The only way out was to drive forward, no traction. And that's one of those times if you suddenly think, I'm on my own in the middle of nowhere, I'm not really being very sensible here. And I suppose it's when reality sinks in and you suddenly think, right, what am I going to do if I can't get moving again? And I panicked for about 5 minutes. I sat down, I had to think about things, tried again, and got out. So
yeah,
I think it was moments like that are when you realise that even Morocco in the remote areas, you're never that far away from a farmstead, somebody herding goats. Well, there's always people around, and the Moroccans are fascinating people. You'll park up in the middle of nowhere, and all of a sudden somebody will appear next to you, and you're thinking, where on earth have they come from? So it's you're always prepared for what if, and I've always got a slight plan of attack of what I'm going to do. Nice thing with Morocco is you've invariably got a mobile phone signal, apart from when things don't go right. And I remember this time I had no mobile phone signal, and over the years I've added to my kit and improved things. I've now got a DeLorme sat tracker, no sat signal either.
Oh, really?
And
That's surprising.
First time I've got an SOS button to summon Thunderbirds or whoever comes, or at least send a text message back to somebody back home to get some help, and I had no signal. I mean, I dare say if I'd walked a few hundred metres up the hillside, I would have had both a mobile phone signal and a sat signal again. But it did sort of bring home that sometimes you just need to think about things before you charge in a little bit gung-ho. I suppose for myself now, having done a few trips, I'm finding I'm pushing myself a bit further, so I am looking for tracks which people aren't using. I'm looking for different routes through areas than what most of the overlanders do.
Yeah.
And I have found some fantastic routes. Last year I took a big group of Land Cruisers out, had 8 Land Cruisers, 10 people, which was hard work. And we found one of the most fantastic routes I've ever done. And I was, as I mentioned earlier, just connecting dots together. I wanted to get from here to here, looked on the maps, that looks like it goes the right way, we'll go and have a look. And it was the most fantastic day's driving we had on that trip.
Yeah.
Crawling along a riverbed, ledge on the side, beautiful scenery, lovely weather, a fantastic day.
Yeah. It's nice to just to go back to something you said just before, and then I'm going to jump forwards again. I liked how you were talking about how much you enjoyed the prep and kind of route planning, and I think there are always kind of 3 stages to any overland trip, and one is the planning and the prep, and that's something I find equally as enjoyable as the actual travelling itself.
Yeah.
Because certainly when we were planning, it was a massive learning curve for me. I was learning something every day. Admittedly, I was sat in front of the computer most of the time, other than the times I was working on the car, and I'd learnt just as much about the world in that planning period, almost as much as I did actually on the trip. So that kind of level of involvement in what you're doing is nice. And then obviously the trip is amazing. And then I think there's a third stage, which is when you return home, which is probably something you're going through now, where you're processing all the things you've seen. Sometimes when you're actually on the trip, you don't really take on board all the things you're seeing, and
No.
it's not until you get back, because you're bombarded with so much and everything is new. It's very difficult to put it into context of the reality of what you've actually experienced. And when you get back and you're looking for all your photos and going through your maps and all your GPS tracks and whatever else, it kind of helps you process what you've kind of gone through and what you've experienced. And then a lot of people, especially if they've undertaken long overland trips, end up sharing all that with people in the form of books, or a lot of, well, if people are on the road for long periods of time, they're blogging as they go. This last trip, I'd been following you on Facebook, and you'd been doing a lot of Facebook updates. And I think those kind of things are really important, just to encourage other people, and so that other people can see what you're up to and what you're doing, which then in turn gives them, maybe lights the torch paper on a firework, which makes them think, oh, I could do that. He's gone over there and he's done that, and he looks like he's having an amazing time. I wish I could do that. And so those kind of processing all the things you experience and then putting it out into the world, I think, is equally as important as actually undertaking the trip and all the planning. I've completely forgotten where I was going on that. I went off on a big long ramble. Anyway, but discovering all those kind of new tracks, and it sounds very much that you really enjoy the driving aspect of it. Has it kind of led to you thinking about doing overland trips in other countries, or are you?
So. And I'll probably get some criticism for this, but I think the thing which really made me suddenly start to think I fancy doing an overland trip was watching Long Way Round.
Okay.
And I know a lot of people are quite critical of Ewan and Charlie's trip, and it was a TV series, so it's probably over glamorised. But I think it was a combination of having watched that and seen the route they've done and the adventures they had, and then also what I wanted to do with seeing more of Morocco. That combination really stirred me into action.
Yeah. When
I was unfortunately made redundant the first time, and that gave me the opportunity to go and do something. I had a bit of time, didn't have any work or any commitments, so let's go and do something while I can.
Yeah.
And that got me running. I do want to go other places, and I think, as you say, that sharing your experiences and your trips, on whether it's writing a book if you're that way inclined, or just on social media, on the internet, on blogs and websites, seeing what other people have put up, and I think, I want to go and see that. Mongolia's on the list at some point. South America's looking more and more attractive as time goes on. There's always the classic Africa routes as well. So there's a lot more I want to do.
Yeah,
it's getting up and doing it, I suppose.
Yeah.
And travelling, was 6 trips now I've done in my Land Cruiser. I've done 2.5 solo trips now, and the others have been with friends or as a group. The first time I went on my own 2 years ago, just a 3-week holiday, and I can remember sitting on the ferry thinking, is this a good idea, going on your own? Am I going to get lonely? Am I going to get bored? What happens if something goes wrong? And I had a great trip. I met a lot of people. Met some really good people who I'm still in contact with now. Met an English tour group who were just setting up, doing organised trips over there, now very well established. Gave them a few pointers in the campsite. But at the end of those 3 weeks, I felt like I needed to come home and talk to somebody I hadn't just met 5 minutes earlier. So this year, again, I'm been made redundant this year, so I've got luxury of time. I had the 3 weeks booked initially. I thought, I'm going to go for 6 weeks. And I think I've learned this year that even being on my own, I can get on and enjoy a trip without needing that support of another person with me. So I think that's pushing me more towards doing a longer trip and not sat there thinking, because I think a couple of years ago I was thinking, yeah, I want to do a longer trip, but I want somebody to come with me. I think I'm getting more organised and more confident in myself to go and do a longer trip on my own. However, I do think it's much better to have somebody with you, whether it's somebody else in your passenger seat or in another vehicle with you, somebody else to share the experiences and somebody to bounce ideas off when things don't quite go right. Had a few concerns with the Land Cruiser on this year's trip, which has been sat in the back of my mind the whole trip, and at times were a bit of a worry being on mine. And I sometimes thought, I actually found myself a few times sat in a cafe enjoying a coffee, talking to myself about the problems I was having with it. And I think sometimes having somebody else to sort of say, well, you know, it's making this noise, I don't think it's anything, and getting that feedback would have been a big help. But yeah, there's longer trips in the future. It's a question of when and where and the logistics.
It's interesting you're talking about those things, because the last few podcasts I've recorded have all been with motorcyclists who are travelling solo, and one thing that always pops up is talking to them is that when you do travel on your own, and actually I've talked to a few other people who've travelled overland in 4x4s who've been travelling on their own, and one of the major benefits to travelling on your own is that you're generally more approachable. Whereas if I, for example, if I'm travelling with my wife, people, especially in Muslim countries, people will see me with my wife, and then they automatically think, there you go, they're closed off, they've got each other, you don't need to talk to them. And it kind of, in some regards, it puts up a bit of a barrier to people actually approaching you. Whereas if you're on your own, I think you're a lot more approachable, which has its benefits when you're travelling.
Interesting point. And I think, thinking about it, now you've mentioned it, I think this year there were probably a few occasions where people did see me on my own and come over. I remember as I was slowly plodding my way north, pulling into a campsite, getting set up. There was a Unimog camper parked over the other side. I just got set up, and Tom, the chap whose Unimog it was, came over with a beer. Don't expect you've got a fridge on there, I've bought you a cold beer. Now, maybe if there'd been two of us there, he wouldn't have done that. I don't know, he might just be a friendly guy. But I had another couple of occasions on the trip where I think possibly because I was on my own, people thought, well, we're going to say hello and come and have a drink and come and have a chat and catch up and share stories and tales of the mysteries of Morocco. And
I think again, like one thing I've certainly discovered travelling in this way and throughout the course of the podcast is there's no right or wrong way of doing this. There's nothing set in stone. No. You know, I've spoken to people who set out originally on the Mongol Rally in a £250 cart, who then got into other overlanding trips. I've spoken to people who've got like a huge, great big truck at the far end of the spectrum, certainly on a financial scale and luxury scale, and you know, all these things. And then I've spoken to people who like on a push bike, who have nothing, and so there's no right or wrong way of doing it. And I think that's the beauty of it. And I think one thing you were talking about there is the kind of you were unsure initially of your kind of the mentality, whether you could do it psychologically, and I think that's something that is an important trait and something you learn very quickly about yourself when you kind of put yourself into these situations. And it's not very often in life like a lot of people coast in life and they don't put themselves in difficult situations, and typically overlanding, the nature of it does mean you are going to end up in difficult situations at some point. It's inevitable.
It's bound to happen.
Yeah.
Whether it's a border crossing, a breakdown, a problem, an illness, something will crop up which really does push you to try and resolve that problem somewhere out of your comfort zone. And sometimes it can be quite stressful trying to deal with that.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think what I've had. And we've had all sorts of things. We've had mechanical problems in the middle of nowhere where we've ended up with two lads who are probably no older than 14 or 15 welding new bits onto the car with no protective equipment or tools or resources available, through to dealing with the army in some places. Last year we were trying to get into a bit of a desert which is unfortunately restricted unless you're in the army, and we spent a lot of time talking to different army people that day. Had 3 army checkpoints trying to stop us going where we wanted to go. The last ones were trying to stop us getting out of where they didn't want us, which was a peculiarity at the time. But it's and for me as well, I suppose something I'm not very good at is languages. So one of the nice things I think for people with Morocco is the majority of the Moroccans will speak French. So it's very easy even if you've got basic French, to go out there and get on and speak French. My French is rubbish. Over the years, I have picked up a little bit of Arabic and a little bit of one of the Berber dialects, but only enough to make people think I know more. So but it very much comes down to probably the odd word in 3 or 4 languages and a lot of sign language to communicate. So that puts an added challenge, I think, onto difficult situations and language barriers. But you get by. It's amazing what you can do with sign language and pointing at things, and I sometimes think the lack of language helps as well. I certainly know as...
generally with the authorities.
Generally with authorities, yeah. Sorry, I don't understand. I know I have... And this was before I started doing the trips in the Land Cruiser. And this was just the days of renting a Fiat Uno and driving round on the road. We got stopped for speeding near Casablanca.
In a Fiat Uno?
In a Fiat Uno, yes. It is possible. It's downhill with a tailwind. We stopped, the policeman came over, started talking in French. I said, we're English. And I just think it was too much bother for him to give us a ticket and extract a fine without the language. So sometimes it does work playing, or being dumb, I suppose. I wasn't even playing dumb on that occasion.
Yeah, my wife says I play it very well.
Sorry, I don't understand you.
Yeah. And again, just to jump back to something we were talking about just earlier, you mentioned Ewan and Charlie's as trippers being an inspiration, and again, it's something I talked about on a previous podcast with a biker, and for me it was quite a big inspiration. Not at the time, I saw it at the time when it was originally released, and kind of took it on board and thought, oh, that's pretty amazing what they're doing. And I'd ridden motorbikes as a youngster, but to see them using motorbikes in that way hadn't really occurred to me. I'd seen people like tourers and that stuff never appealed to me, because I always liked sports bikes and dirt bikes, and a tourer was just, to me, seemed like the most boring type of motorbike there was. But then to see them using it in that way to get to these remote places was amazing, and I kind of filed that away in my head until I came through to Overlanding for another trip I'd done out in the Middle East, which essentially was a holiday but then had a big road trip element to it, and then it kind of entered my consciousness again, and I went back and rewatched it, and I found it incredibly inspiring. And I think they are often criticised, like you said, but generally by the hardcore overlanders.
Yes.
But one thing that's really important to remember, and just to go back to the point I made just before, that there's no fixed way of doing this, and you have to take into consideration at the time he was just about to go and film Star Wars, or just had filmed Star Wars, one of the two. It was around the same period. He's a pretty big actor. They are going to have a fairly hefty budget. Yeah. They've got time restraints, and the other thing to take into consideration was they're making a documentary. The documentary has to work. It can't fail. Yeah. All the people that have invested in it You know, well, basically it can't fail. So they were heavily criticised, but I think to some degree quite unfairly. And what happened as a result of that, the amount of people they inspired, and the knock-on effect was incredible.
And I think that's what some of the critics of the programme have missed. Yes, if you're a experienced world traveller, you know what you're doing, you're well versed in it. It was probably making things look a little bit easy, or it was a bit glossed over, but it's inspired new people to get up, buy a motorbike, buy a 4x4, just go in the normal cart and go and do something they probably wouldn't have done beforehand.
Yeah.
And that's got to be a positive.
Yeah.
Is getting that inspiration out there into people to go and see something new, go and challenge themselves a bit more.
I think also on the flip side of the coin, though, I think they were possibly criticised because up until that point, I think there were a group of hardcore overlanders who probably were a bit annoyed that their kind of scene had been exposed to the everyday man, who then in turn was like, well, it's the same thing that happened with digital photography. Up until that point, photographers were photographers. They knew how to use a darkroom, and then digital cameras came out, and then everyone was a photographer.
Yes,
and I think there's possibly an element of that.
I suppose also with the timing of A Long Way Round, it was, the internet was there, but again, those older, experienced travellers, when the internet wasn't probably used as widely to share stories and trips and information, it was almost, we're these rough, tough adventurers and people don't do this. So the TV series came out, which inspired a lot of people. I think a lot more people were getting used to the internet and more information was available. So it's that timing of things as well has probably played a big part in inspiring more people to go out and looking into watching the TV series and then looking on the internet and seeing what people actually you can do this with a bog standard transit van and a mattress in the back if you really want. You can do it however you want. There is, as you say, there's no right or wrong way of travelling and doing a trip. It's getting out there and doing it.
Yeah, and I think what's important, just to bring it back to Morocco, is again to do with trip intentions to some degree, but also the people's level of comfort zone. You know, Mongolia may be way out of someone's comfort zone, but Morocco is potentially achievable because it's so close, and then you can get there in 2-3 days if you really want, or whichever way you decide to get there. So if you don't like it, you can come back. Whereas Mongolia is a bigger commitment to get there. And I think what's really important about overlanding is not necessarily the destinations. I think there's... this will contradict myself from a previous podcast where I said there was no kind of snobbery within the overland world, but I think there is to some degree. And I think there will be people who've undertaken longer trips who are probably the same people who are criticising Ewan and Charlie, who feel that people who undertake shorter trips are lesser to some degree, or there's a kind of hierarchy. Well, it's like, well, I've driven to Siberia and you've only been to Morocco, so I'm better than you. But that's not how it should be measured. It should be measured taking into consideration all the factors. People have mortgages, kids, families, time commitments, but also the level of how far people go outside of their comfort zone. To some people who are quite experienced travellers, Mongolia might not be that much of a challenge if you're an experienced traveller. Whereas if you're Dave from up north in Yorkshire, who's never been outside of Yorkshire in his Land Rover, who then decides to go to Morocco, that is a massive shift outside of his comfort zone.
I remember getting back from my first trip and feeling like I'd been on a sort of the expeditions of the 1950s. I think I've been out in the middle of nowhere and nobody else has ever been there, and all full of that adventure. And then now sort of getting out to Morocco, so, yeah, actually this fairly normal routine. There's a lot of people who do it. There's thousands of people go every year, all nationalities. It's not as wild and remote as you, but it's the experience. It's getting out there. It's doing something. It's seeing it. And for some people, and I still think for a lot of people, going out to Morocco overland, it is a real adventure.
Yeah,
and
I think so.
It goes back to something I said earlier about that culture shock on such a short travelling time. If you're looking at sort of your normal traditional tourist, 3.5 hour flight gets you from London to Marrakesh. It's the same as going to Spain.
Yeah.
And you're in that different culture. The world in Morocco and everyday life is very, very different.
Yeah.
So for people who are new to it, it is a big adventure.
Yeah.
There is a country which isn't the same as ours. You can't just go to the local supermarket and stock up on things. You've got to take things a bit further. You've got to be more prepared to deal with the country and learn about it.
But even still, like we kind of right at the very beginning, I said Morocco is often the gateway drug to overlanding. For us, actually, we ended up going to Mongolia before we went to Morocco, and actually still arriving in Morocco and crossing the Straits of Gibraltar. There was also still a lot of apprehension. At that point, we thought we were quite seasoned travellers. We've been to Mongolia, but it'd been the first time I'd ever entered the African continent. I didn't really know what to expect, and there's always a sense of anticipation and intrepidation before you cross any borders. But for me, the excitement travelling into Morocco was way more than some other countries because it was so foreign, and I think there is. If you've never been to Africa before, and again, this area of North Africa is quite different to sub-Saharan Africa, because obviously the religions and stuff, it's a lot more Islamic, and the culture is still very different to the rest of Africa. But it's still such an alien place to come from Europe, and that's what's interesting about it, is that transition. I find it incredibly fascinating. So, like, now you've kind of, do you still feel that there's bits of Morocco you haven't seen, or do you think you've done it in total? How long have you spent there then?
Oh God, I wouldn't like to add it out. In terms of mileage, or whenever I'm on a trip, I work in kilometres. I just as soon as I get in the truck with it fully loaded, I switch to kilometres, and it just happens. So my average trip, I've done 5, 6, 7,000 kilometres. This latest one, 11,000 kilometres. So it's sort of 45,000 kilometres of overlanding in Morocco, and I still want to explore the east side of the country more, the empty quarter, and I still want to get down across the Western Sahara to Dakhla off-road. So those are two big things I really want to do still in Morocco. I think when I've done those, I might start looking at other destinations. But Morocco will always be there as a country I know I can go back to. I know I can do more overlanding there. I'll always see something different. I think something I've noticed over the years, and probably other people who've experienced Morocco on a fairly regular basis notice, is how fast a country is developing. It's sometimes a bit frustrating when you're expecting a nice dirt track for the day and you get there and there's a nice fresh layer of tarmac on it. But things are changing fast out there, and I think also I've noticed over the years the amount of not necessarily overlanding people out there, but off-road trips. And I use the terms differently because I see them in a slightly different way. The numbers of people doing the trips off-road are increasing year on year, and I can see it will get to a point at some point where it becomes more controlled, and the authorities are having to do more to limit where people are going or keep them onto certain routes. And I mentioned people off-roading. Saw this year a lot of groups who weren't your traditional overlanders, with set up for being able to camp where they stopped. They were very much on a package holiday type trip. So it's
Yeah.
either groups of small motorbikes, and they were going hotel to hotel. They had a van taking their luggage, and I'm sure it's great fun. I've never ridden anything more than a 50cc scooter, and that scared the life out of me. But I can say, and also groups, and a lot of Spanish and French groups of 4x4s doing the similar thing. So they didn't have roof tents with them. They didn't have camping equipment. They had a suitcase in the back of a very nice, well-prepared vehicle, but they were going 5-star hotel to 5-star hotel, which is a very different way of travelling. So I do think Morocco will change. It changes every year. Bet it's better for the country and the locals. Probably not so good for those of us who are trying to get out and experience the more adventurous side. Knowing Morocco, that change could take 100 years. It could take 5. It's one of those countries where things change left, right and centre, and they'll build a new road and they'll dig it up 12 months later because they didn't like where it was or some other strange reason. Things will change. I think if people are thinking of getting out, get out. It's like everywhere though. Once it gets onto that tourist trail and people start to see it as being an easy option, things change very quickly, and not always for the better. Often for the better for the local economy and the local people, but not necessarily for the experiencing the real side of the country.
It's interesting. The point you just mentioned there, that the people who are going these off-road trips, again though, one thing that's popped up frequently over the course of the podcast is this kind of idea of the way that we travel, that there is some kind of cultural exchange, so that the people, the inhabitants of the country you're visiting, get something back from you actually being there. And I think typically overlanders who are in kind of wilderness areas or areas where typical tourists don't go to do frequently get approached by locals, and then you do have a really interesting cultural exchange. For example, we always carry photographs of England and back home and our families, and there's always some kind of dialogue where they learn about the country we're from, as well as you learning about their cultures, and then exchanging food quite often, and just they're interested in how you travel and looking at your tent, especially in nomadic countries. They really love that. And there needs to be some kind of cultural exchange. And I think if people are going on these kind of shorter off-road trips, I don't think that cultural exchange is happening, which is quite sad, because basically people are coming and just using the country as a playground.
And I think possibly all of my overlanding experiences in Morocco, and apart from the blast through Spain to and from, you see sometimes these groups, they're just blasting through a little village in the middle of nowhere, and you can see how the locals, it's a group of 4x4s, they come through at 30-40 miles an hour, great cloud of dust, scattering the goats and the children everywhere in their wake. You can see how it can almost undermine that experience for people who are travelling a bit slower and want to stop and experience and learn a bit about that culture, because it almost turns some of the locals off engaging with travellers. I've not had that myself, and the Moroccans are, as a people, always surprise. The invitations to come and have, whether it's just to go and have a mint tea with somebody you've met at the top of a mountain pass because you just happened to stop there and they've appeared, or stay with them, or come and have a meal. There's always an offer, and it's usually an adventure. Sometimes it's quite hard work, but it's a great way of meeting people. And the language barriers aren't always a problem, and Morocco can be a difficult country with languages depending where you are. Arabic, French, any other Western language, and then you've got 5 Berber dialects, and 2 Moroccans won't necessarily be able to communicate. When we first started going on our tourist trip, flying in, we used to rent an apartment from a local policeman's family, and we got to know some of the locals. And the policeman would come round, and another friend of ours had come round. One was a Berber, one was an Arab. They couldn't communicate unless they spoke French.
Yeah.
And we picked up bits and pieces of the language from both of them. We could talk to one of them in one of the Berber dialects. The other one didn't have a clue. We used to go up into the mountains and go back to one of the mountain villages, and 5, 6 English lads turn up, and we're staying in a basic Berber farmhouse, no running water, no electricity, car battery to power the light bulb in the corner, and we were probably quite a burden on the family just to appear. But you're always welcomed with open arms, and nothing is too much trouble for them. And that village, which probably introduced us to some of the off the tourist trail parts of Morocco initially, all those years ago, there was one of the old guys who lived in the village. We were the first white people to have visited that village in 60 years. And you'd be sat round in the evening after a meal, and all the village would filter through the house to come and see the foreigners, and come and point at us. And no, it wasn't quite, but they're generally interested to come and try and communicate and exchange things. And it's fascinating getting that exposure to the local way of life.
And again, no, but that's exactly what I was talking about. It is a cultural exchange, even at its most basic. Even if the people in that village had never seen a white person, that for them is a cultural exchange. And I think it's important to take the time. There's nothing I find kind of, I don't know, not offensive it's not the right word, because again I think it's different levels of people's comfort zones, but I find it incredibly frustrating when I see people who travel like we do, who kind of just roll through with the windows wound up, and it's almost like a zoo. It's like, we're looking at them and they're all staring at us, and for me I find that difficult. There does need to be some level of cultural exchange. I think it's really important and valuable, but again, I don't want to kind of tar people for that, or because again it's a confidence thing, and it's different levels of comfort zone, and I think that's what's important to remember.
I'm always a windows open traveller.
Well, we have to be. We took the air conditioning out our car.
I was going to say my aircon doesn't work, so that helps. But no, I you could be, as you say, sat there with the windows wound up and the aircon, and you don't really experience wind the windows down, let the country come inside. It might take you 6 months
and
after the trip
dust
to get
of
it
the
back
Sahara,
out again. There's dust in mine which will never ever come out of it. But it's the smells and just being able to say hello to somebody as you drive past, or wave out the window at them. And I always try to wave at people when I'm passing. Will always slow down. If I'm going through a village, I will always slow down and crawl through it and wave and smile and say hello to people. And if I need to stop and pick up some supplies, stop and pick up some supplies. And you'll be surprised travelling that way of how often you'll come across a new experience, whether it's going to somebody's house for a cup of mint tea or just stopping and chatting with them at times.
Well, one of the reasons why I think it's so important is because to some degree, I guess we're anyone who travels is essentially an ambassador for their country, and that works both ways. For example, when we were in Iran, the people there were just incredibly friendly and amazing, and they were fully aware that we had preconceptions about their country, which was very media driven, and that they were insistent that we didn't judge their country on their politics and government. And I think the same goes for us. I think maybe some of these countries have preconceptions about what the West is like and what the English are like, or being a European is like. And I think to go there and exchange is just as valuable for them to see that ultimately we are the same. Family is important, kids are important, on ground level, just the way we live and survive. We're all on this planet just trying to get through life and do whatever we can to survive. And obviously there are different levels of surviving and luxuries. But I think, and for us it's very easy to travel, but for a lot of these people it's not,
No.
and they don't have that luxury. So that's for me, it's just as valuable. But it's nice to know that you have similar experiences that a lot of other people have.
Certainly with Morocco, something I've had just conversations with locals about over the recent years is the global troubles with IS and Al Qaeda, and the locals at times. Morocco's quite exposed to Western life, of probably more so than a lot of Islamic countries, and they see what's being portrayed in the media, and you get into those conversations. That's not us. And they do generally get quite concerned. And I also think particularly Morocco, has been quite badly hit in the tourism industry as a result of both the recession a few years ago and also the concern Europeans and Westerners have over Islamic countries, which is perpetuated by the media at times.
Well, especially their connection, Morocco's connection with France. Obviously there's a historical connection there, the language, and a lot of French people do go to Morocco over the winter. And I think since the terror attacks in France, I should imagine the tourism trade has been hit to some degree, which is a real shame. And again, that's something that's reiterated by everyone we meet in Islamic countries, and generally people who are well informed know that. But unfortunately, it's not what the media is telling us or perpetuating.
And again, I suppose it's another part of the travelling side of things. It's don't believe what the internet tells you or the Daily Telegraph tells you. Get out, go and experience it firsthand. Obviously, there's parts of the world you wouldn't dream of travelling in unless you're very, very brave, and people do. But it's much better to go and form your own opinions and believe what is put through the TV or the internet all the time. Go and find your own way. Experience things. And I can remember the only time I've ever felt slightly uncomfortable in Morocco, and this was a long time ago. So this was just when the US, etc., went into Iraq, and we were. Where were we? I forget where we were now, but we'd down on the edge of the desert in a small town, staying in a local hotel. We got up that morning and we went into one of the cafes for breakfast and get a coffee. And Al Jazeera was broadcasting live the first US troops going in. And there was a lot of locals in there watching the news. And we opened the door and it went quiet. And everybody turned round and looked at us. We thought, that's unusual. And then saw what was on the telly, and that split second you thought, okay. And then they all started talking again. The waiter come in, sit down, well, you're welcome. It was over and done with. But certainly recent years, I do get a lot of people back here saying, why do you want to go to an Islamic country? Do you feel safe? Do you feel... Not at all. I feel more concerned about safety in London than I do in Marrakesh. That's just probably just me, but never any concerns about being out in that part of the world, and it's fantastic. And the people they're like us, everyday people. They're not worried about the politics so much. Yes, they get frustrated with our government, but they just want to get on. They want to have a happy life. They want to feed the kids, and meet people, and enjoy themselves the same as everybody else. And it's getting out there and meeting them and breaking down those barriers, I suppose. I
think that's. I'm just glanced at the clock and I'm aware we're well over it now. But that seems like a nice point to finish on. But just. I was quite keen to do one particular podcast very much focused on Morocco, because it is a huge part of kind of the overlanding community, and I think a lot of people have gone there. Do you have kind of one piece of advice for people who are maybe new to the overlanding community, or new or thinking about doing an overland trip, who've come to kind of overlanding through kind of 4x4 travel, and people who aren't necessarily travellers, who've not done a huge amount of travel.
Do it. Is the advice. And if you're thinking about it and you don't feel confident, get in touch with one of the tour companies who do organised trips to Morocco. I mean, there's a good number of them, UK based, so you haven't got that language barrier if you put it. They offer good support. They know the country. It's a good way to get out there for that first time and see how things work. Or do it on your own. Morocco's not that difficult a country to enjoy your own. Bit of common sense. And get out and enjoy it. I think that's the big message is to go and do it. You can sit in the armchair sipping your mulled wine over Christmas thinking about it for the next 10 years. Get out, go and do it.
Take that first step.
Yeah.
Perfect. Excellent. Well, that seems like a very relevant place to stop, I think. Yeah. Thank you very much for your time.
That's okay. It's my pleasure.
Perfect. Having spoken to stacks of overlanders now, it has become apparent that there are as many approaches to overlanding as overlanders themselves. Not everyone might agree on how people do things within the community, but there is enough room for all of us, and we can all certainly learn something from one another. Having met people on the road who have been travelling from point A to B in a very limited time, and witnessing how little they experience in comparison to someone travelling much slower, I think Mark is onto something good. I think there is a lot of value in exploring a place fully, and really getting to know it and the people who live there. Throughout the series, we've discovered that every overlander has a unique approach. Mark's travels have not been global adventures, and he doesn't spend all his time promoting himself via a fancy website. What is important is that he has really grasped the essence and fundamentals of this style of travelling. On every trip he explores the landscape a little further and pushes his own personal boundaries that little bit more. And that is where you really learn new things, not only about the country you are in, but also about yourself. If you like the show, please subscribe on iTunes and write us a review, as this helps boost our podcast up the listings. We're also Overland Tribe leaders on the new autofocus social media platform Drive Tribe. Sign up, search Overlanding Podcast and join our tribe. If you're an overlander yourself and have an interesting story, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at aroundtheworldin800days@mail.com, or you can get in touch with us via our website, theoverlandingpodcast.com. You'll also find links to all our social media channels on there. Please like, share, bump, and give us a thumbs up along the way. As usual, many thanks for joining us around the campfire. That's it for this week. Goodbye.